More time after time. So now we're moving into the Magdalenians. So we have talked about, you've now seen this figure so many times, you're probably starting to roll your eyeballs at me. Looking at temperature change over the last 650,000 years ago. Now we keep moving closer and closer to that last glacial maximum. And now we are there. So the last glacial maximum, it was really just an absolutely spectacular change in climate. It's really difficult to understate the importance, the influence, the amount of influence that this had on human populations at the time. So ran from about 24,000 years ago to about 18,000 years ago. And again, it's not something that just turned on overnight and turned off overnight. It's a gradual cooling and then a gradual warming up. So, but roughly speaking, 24,000 years ago to 18,000 years ago. During this time, the mean global temperature on the Earth dropped by 5 degrees Celsius. 5 degrees. It's a dramatic shift. It dramatically changes where plants and animals can survive. And in fact, not only is there a dramatic shift on where they can survive, it's also a dramatic shift in global precipitation. Because remember, a lot of water on Earth is being trapped, is being frozen in the Arctic regions and also in glaciers. There was, during this time period, a 10% decline in global precipitation. This didn't happen evenly around the world. There were regions where the decline in precipitation was much greater than in other regions, but globally it was 10%, but it was a very uneven distribution. There was a 36% expansion of areas that were desert. There was a 20% reduction in tropical rainforest. The global net primary productivity is estimated to have been half of what it was post-glacially, so before the industrial era. So what this means is the life that was producing things, the amount of plants and animals and that productivity of life on the planet during the last glacial maximum was half of what was going on after the last glacial maximum. It's really difficult to measure before that, so the comparison is made with what things were like after the last glacial maximum. Half. So imagine a world that's about half the biological productivity of what you're familiar with. That's what happened, a dramatic decline in the biological productivity of life on Earth. And also, sea level dropped by 120 meters. It's about the equivalent of a 4-story building. So, tyranny of the present, things were a lot different. Let's look at a map. So here's a reconstruction of what Europe would have looked like about 20,000 years ago during the last ice age. Notice that you have this expansive tundra across Eurasia, across where Germany and France are today. Down on that Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal are today, you had these forests, and that's where you have these human occupations. Because remember, things were so dry. You had that loss of precipitation, that you had human populations needing to move into more productive regions. So they're basically all of these different cultural groups moving south, moving into refugia as tundra expanded, which is inhospitable because there's so little rainfall, and then also as you have glaciers expanding. So then, as you get to about 19,000 years ago into 18,000 years ago, that ice starts to recede, sea level starts to rise, you have more global precipitation. That's the 5,000 years that we're going to focus on right now. So as the ice starts to recede, 19,000 years ago to about 14,000 years ago. So I mentioned that humans had moved into these lower latitude regions, so that Gravettian expansion that had been kind of rocking and rolling across Europe for about 10 to 11,000 years. Then you had the Ice Age, and during that time period, you had a population that had moved into that Iberian Peninsula. As the ice starts to recede, the people who then that cultural group had kind of morphed into, that population starts to expand north and east. And those people are called the Magdalenians. So this is the Magdalenian expansion. Now, the Magdalenian culture is a group of people, again, who had taken refuge on the Iberian Peninsula during the last ice age. And so they had that that genetic isolation during that time period, because they were kind of isolated on the Iberian Peninsula. So they're isolated from other human populations. So remember, genetic isolation leads to genetic differentiation, right? Okay. So then as the ice sheets receded, we see this population expanding north and east. They were hunting reindeer. They are associated with the extinction of the mammoth that happened around that time period. So again, mammoth hunters associated with the extinction. We have sites that represent the Magdalenian culture found from Portugal all the way to Poland. So that's how we can see their cultural expansion, as well as picking up evidence in the ancient genomes. They had bone and ivory tools like the Gravettians before them, and evidence of even more art than what we saw with the Gravettians. Now let's think about what happened. So you have the end of the Ice Age. Now, as you're looking at this graph, I have age on the x-axis, and it's going from older on the right to younger on the left. So we're going from 22,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago. And then they have the mean annual temperature. So you can see the last glacial maximum there on the far right at 22,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. And there's a little bit of a gradual build out of it at 18,000 years ago. It's kind of takes a little bit of time to, many thousand years to really come out of that last glacial maximum. Remember, I said it didn't happen overnight. But what happens at just before 14,000 years ago, we think that there was, because of a shift in ocean currents, there was this really dramatic warming event that happened called the Bowling-Alarod. And it's this really dramatic warming event at about 14,000 years ago, just before 14,000 years ago. And with that warming event, that dramatic climatological event that happened especially felt in the region of Europe, is really big things start happening with human cultural change. And that is where we're going to pick up our story with in the next video. So at the end of that warming event at 14,000 years ago, plant and animal domestication starts to happen. Agriculture, horses, they all come into play after those ice sheets melted 14,000 years ago with that dramatic warming event. And let me turn the music back on. And then you don't have to listen to it again, because we'll shift themes. I feel so goofy doing this. Hopefully I'm keeping you entertained. See you later.